Here we have a simple GraphQL Yoga server that is returning some users and some posts. We have various fields on the user, ID, name and is admin boolean, and also on the post type we have an ID and a title. We have a server, we are passing the type definitions for our server that resolves to the users and the posts, and we have the resolvers here that map to those arrays. We also have a mutation to update a user, and if any error occurs, we'll throw an error user not found. If we want to expose this error to the user, GraphQL Yoga exports a GraphQL Yoga error class that we can use to throw that error. We'll need to use this because GraphQL Yoga by default masks all errors. Because we're using GraphQL Yoga, we can take advantage of Envelop. Envelop is the missing GraphQL plugin system. This allows us to hook into any part of the GraphQL execution phase with our own plugins. We can hook into parsing, validating, executing, and much more. In this video today, we want to hook in to the execution phase and we want to add a cache plugin. If we now explore the plugin hub for Envelop, we can see there are a ton of different plugins that we can use and add to our GraphQL server. The plugin that we'll be using today will be the Use Response Cache. This allows us to skip the execution phase and reduce the server load by caching execution results in memory. In a real-world application or in a serverless environment, you may want to opt for the Redis cache. All the details can be found in here on how you can use the Response Cache Redis plugin from Envelop. We'll explore using the Redis cache in a future video, but today let's just have a look at the in-memory LRU cache, which is the default out-of-the-box caching mechanism. Let's grab the plugin dependency name, and over inside of our code, let's install that dependency. Now with that installed, let's go ahead and import Use Response Cache from that plugin. Now inside of my GraphQL server configuration, I want to pass an array to the key plugins. Here we'll use Response Cache, and we'll not add anything to this just yet. If we open the terminal and we run the server, if we go to localhost 4000 and make a request, you can see that we are fetching all of our results here. If we make a request to fetch all of our users, you can see it's instantly returned to us. What's happening in the background is this is actually cached in memory. And if we also run the query to fetch all of our posts, this will now be cached inside of our result with all of the defaults part of the Use Response Cache plugin. Now you don't have to take my word that this is actually happening. We can actually include the extension metadata as a configuration to the Use Response Cache object. Now if we go back and make a request, we'll see inside of extensions here that we have a cache hit false. If we run this once more, you'll see that we have a response cache hit true. And if we continue to run this, that will be now hitting that cache every single time we go to execute that query. If we change this query back to fetch users and we fetch the ID and name, now if we execute this query, it will be a cache hit false. If we run it again, it will also now be cached. What happens if we add another field? Is admin? Well, we've never ran this query before, so this ideally shouldn't be in the cache. If we execute this, we can see that we have a cache hit false. And if we go back to run this, we're now hitting that cache again. I can demonstrate how this works if I remove the isAdmin field. Because we've already run this query before, it will fetch that from the cache. Now, what if we updated the user name? Well, the response cache actually takes care of invalidating the cache when we update using the key field ID. When we run this mutation, we can see here that the response cache has invalidated the entity type name user where the ID is JB. You can configure which field will be used for uniquely identifying a resource or entity. By default, the ID is used that we can see here. And this is great. This gives you a great amount of customizability when configuring your cache. Now you're probably thinking, well, I may not want to cache everything. Maybe I want to cache certain types for a specific time. Well, you can do that using the TTL per type schema. You can set a global time to live, or you can set it per type. Now for the post type, let's cache this for 1200 milliseconds. Now if we go back and we go to fetch all of our posts, if we execute this query and we continue to execute it, you will see after 1200 milliseconds has passed that that cache has now been invalidated. Instead of using TTL per type configuration to decide whether you should cache and for how long, you can also use the function shouldCacheResult. You can provide your own shouldCacheResult function that gets the result, and then you can determine whether or not you want to cache by returning a boolean true or false. We can see here inside of the mutation, if there is no user found, that we'll throw an error. Mutation operations are never cached. However, if an error is thrown, the underlying entity or resource will also not be updated because that error has thrown. We can test this out by updating our query here to fetch all of our users. If we fetch the ID and name, and we then cache this, if we now go to update a user where the ID is something else, we'll see that an unexpected error has occurred and nothing was invalidated. If we go back and we run this query, this works as it did before because we didn't invalidate anything and everything is cached as it was before. Response Cache has a ton of different configuration options that you can explore when working with it. Whether you need to cache based on a query name, a type, or anything else, you've got full customizability inside of the configuration here. If we explore the docs, we can also see that we can cache based on the user session. So if we have a user, we may not want to cache anything, and if we do, we may want to only cache when they're an admin or not an admin. It's worth remembering that you can get into trouble using caching when you have authenticated users. We'll cover in a future video on how you can mitigate this using the Response Cache plugin.